Welcome, everybody. My name is Marty Mascari. I am with the North Central Texas Area Agency on Aging and the North Central Texas Aging and Disability Resource Center, or ADRC, both of which are under the North Central Texas Council of Governments. I'm a contractor with them, but we are blessed once again to have our partners at the James L. West Center here in Fort Worth, Texas. And we are all in the greater Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so all of you that are joining us from anywhere else, welcome. This is where our service area, well, it's not your service area, that's wrong, because you guys serve people all over the place, right? I mean, in regards to all your online stuff and everything, that's right.
We do.
That's right. For us, it's our service area. So we're blessed to have Holly to talk about Hospice 101. But before we do that, if we could advance one slide, we're going to talk about CEUs for those of you that are interested in obtaining CEUs or certificate of attendance for today's webinar. The CEUs are being offered by the James L. West Center for licensed nurses, licensed social workers, and licensed professional counselors in the state of Texas. Please note that you're more than welcome to, I believe, to get a certificate and submit it to other jurisdictions, but there's no guarantee they'll take it. I've had people with other licenses within the state and people outside the state that have told me before they've been able to use them from time to time. But again, there's no guarantee, but you're more than welcome to go through the process, get the certificate, and submit it to your jurisdiction. Today's webinar is worth 1.5 hours of CE credits. You must, to get any of the certificates, you must complete the SurveyMonkey evaluation. The SurveyMonkey evaluation will be sent out to you in a follow-up email from me after we're done. And so please, you must complete that if you want any type of certificate, because that's what initiates that process. That monkey evaluation, SurveyMonkey evaluation, will be open until the 20th of this month. So if you could get it done, the sooner the better. But once it's closed, it usually stays closed. We do not reopen it. It's just too difficult to process certificates one at a time if people are unable to make that. So we've kind of had to hold pretty hard to that deadline. So the sooner you can get it done, the better it is for everybody. The certificates will be emailed to you to the email address you provide when you fill out the SurveyMonkey survey, and give them about 3 to 4 weeks. You guys, even with mine, it varies. We flex. Sometimes I get way ahead on them and we're right on top of them. And then other times I have technical issues and other things that cause me to have to set those aside for a while and just get back to them when I can. So please give them a little bit of time. If they don't get it after 4 weeks, please let me know, or just give me an email and we'll look into it. In addition to the SurveyMonkey evaluation form, there's also a Google survey. You will receive that in the email as well, the follow-up email, but you'll also be able to access that as you close out of Zoom today after the webinar. So that should pop up and give you a chance to go there. We ask that you complete that because that helps us report back on the goals and objectives we set out when we applied for the funding to bring you these webinars. So if you could help us with that, we would certainly appreciate it. And so, Holly Glover, I'm turning it over to you.
All right, thank you. I am fighting the back end of a sinus infection, so I'm trying to not be coughing. Got my drink here, got my cough drops, got my Kleenex. I think we're ready to go. We're going to power through. All right, we're glad that you're here for a topic that so many times we have a hard time talking about. Hospice 101, everything you ever wanted to know but were afraid to ask. We've done this one several times. We always have a really big turnout, and it is probably, I say this about most of them, my favorite topic, one of my favorite things to talk about, because being able to come in and educate folks about hospice. The good thing about healthcare here in the United States is that new statistics come out every January and every August. So we have some brand new statistics. This was just updated yesterday and today. I also just happen to have a daughter who's an LMSW who came over today and helped me do some updating as well. So this is going to be the most up-to-date information. One of the things I want to start with when we think about hospice, I want you to go ahead and start shifting your mind that hospice focuses on caring for that person who has a terminal disease, but they are not curing the person. So we are past the point of a cure or being able to cure them, and we're going to provide care and quality of life. Here is my information for those of you who need that for your CEs. We've got our course description, our course outline, and of course our objectives. And again, these have been put in the chat. They'll be mailed to you again, and they were in the email that you got earlier. So let's get started. We've got a lot to cover. We're going to start out with the 3 different types of care. So basically, we have 3 types of care. And the first type of care is curative care. And this is where we are focusing on quantity of life. We are focusing on a cure, and we're focusing on prolonging life for as long as possible. Now, some things that can happen when we focus on curative care is that it can cause suffering if we continue to try to focus on curative care after a cure is no longer possible. And sometimes working in the field of dementia, I will see families do this simply because they're not educated. And that's one of the reasons that we offer programs like this. And sometimes because we get focused on our feelings as the caregiver, and we take the focus off of the person who has dementia or who has any other terminal illness. Curative care can include respirators, IVs, life support, central lines, tube feeding, full resuscitation, and full recession would be chest compressions. If a person does not have their paperwork done, their advance directives, and if there is nobody to make a decision for them, this is what's going to happen, is curative care. And those of you in the state of Texas will make your decision for you. And that decision will be that they will put you on life support if you do not have advance directives. That's another reason why it is really smart for all of us over the age of 18. And I know we don't like to talk about it. We don't want to talk about young people ever having anything happen to them, or even us that maybe aren't necessarily a young person, but we're not considered an old person. Why in the world would I do my advance directives or my medical power of attorney? Well, first of all, I don't want my kids to have to make those decisions for me. And second of all, I want to make sure my wishes are carried out. You've got to think about those things. So curative care is the first type. The second type is what's called palliative care. And we're going to talk a lot about palliative care because one of the questions we're going to answer today is, what is the difference in palliative care and hospice care? But palliative care focuses on comfort and quality of life as well as quality of death. But you can be on palliative care while receiving treatments. So palliative care views death as a part of natural life. And palliative care is comfort care that helps lessen and relieve physical, psychosocial, and spiritual suffering so that the patient can accomplish their goals and their life closure. And again, we're going to talk specifically about palliative care and when we switch from palliative care to hospice care. The past couple of weeks, I've done some classes, and I've been seeing a fairly new term called neuropalliative care. Neuropalliative care. It's something that we're going to start hearing more about. It's palliative care that focuses on people who have neurological diseases. So that's going to be interesting. And then hospice care. Hospice care is going to focus on comfort and quality of life. This is when There is no longer a cure. It is the most intensive form of comfort care, and it is intended for approximately the last 6 months of a person's life. It focuses on care and not a cure, because by the time we come on hospice care, there is no longer a cure. I want us to start with this brief, I think it's less than 3 minutes. This is going to be an overview of kind of a Hospice 101, and then we're going to deep dive into hospice. Yeah, 2 minutes.
As people live longer and medical treatments are more advanced, we tend to see older patients with a lot of complex medical needs. So there is a increasing need for hospice, and most people wish to be in the place where they've lived. They don't want to spend their last moments and days in the ER or in the hospital. They want to spend them with the people that they love and the environment that they love. And so we have a great need for this. And that's what hospice is able to do. They're a great support system to help patients age and ultimately spend their last days of their life in an environment that they choose to be in. Hospice is part of medicine that we utilize when somebody has a terminal illness that can't be cured. It's thought of as just the end of life. And it is on a certain level, because if you have an illness that can't be cured by traditional medical, treatments, then, we say this person is terminal. But hospice is so much more than that. It's about people really focusing on quality of life. It's about patients and families saying, my treatment or my illness doesn't have a treatment. But that doesn't mean that I don't have hope, that I don't have happiness. That means I'm going to stay home. I'm going to stay wherever my home may be, whether it's a facility, it's, with my daughter or wherever. And I'm going to focus on the things that make me happy and that make me comfortable. And the hospice team helps them do that. So as their disease progresses, they may have symptoms that are then treated by the physician, but they also listen to their spiritual needs and emotional needs. And we have music volunteers and massage therapists and pet volunteers. So they really get to know the whole patient, and they get to say, okay, this is what this whole person needs, not just the disease, not just the symptoms. And then as a team, we figure out what we can do to get them that care. And this will continue till the very last breath. It's one of the best things that medicine can provide to our community.
That is a great overview. I want to start with the history of hospice. I think it's important that we understand where this came from. And I think it's also important that we understand that in the big scheme of things, it has not been part of our care in the United States for very long. And it has not been a Medicare benefit for that long. So I want us to just briefly look at the history of hospice. Now, you might think when you hear that word hospice, you're going to be able to relate it to some other words that we have. Hospital comes from the word hospice, hospitable. So whenever you look and you see that word hospice, it actually comes from a Latin word that means guest, visitor, stranger, or host. And it started out as Crusaders were on their way to the Holy Land, and they found places of refuge to stay in monasteries. Now, they became known as hospices because so many of the pilgrims who were traveling were in ill health, and they ended up dying there, or they spent their last days there, and they were taken care of, and so it became known as a hospice. Now, come up to 1963, and in 1963, Dame Cicely Saunders introduced hospice to the United States. She was visiting Yale, and she established the first purpose-built hospice in London in 1967. What that means is they actually had a building that was just for hospice patients. It wasn't a wing in a hospital. It wasn't a unit somewhere. It was a building that was specific for hospice. And I want you to hear her philosophy. I've got it in red and bold because I want you to hear this quote. This still holds true today. So hear this. You matter because you are you. You matter to the last moment of your life. We will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to help you live until you die. That's powerful. That is powerful. To help you die peacefully, but help you live until you die. That right there shows you that hospice is not giving up. Hospice is not when we lose all hope. She lectured about holistic care in the 1960s. And she lectured to medical students, nurses, social workers, and chaplains. This is sounding familiar. It's sounding like our current hospice teams. And it set off a chain of events. So in 1965, she became a visiting faculty member at the Yale School of Nursing. And then in 1968, the dean of the Yale School of Nursing took a sabbatical and went to work at St. Christopher's to learn everything she could about hospice. And then everything changed in 1969 when Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published her book on death and dying. And for those of you that are professionals on today who are counselors and social workers and work in the medical field, I think we all have studied Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She identified 5 stages through which many terminally ill patients progress. The book became an international bestseller and is still used and referred to today. Now, in her book, she talked about the stages being denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And then with David Kessler, they wrote more, and they came up with a 6th stage called meaning. Now, we know that people do not progress through those stages, check, 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 check. And we also know that we use those stages in many different ways now. But she started us talking about this. That's what's so important about Kubler-Ross. Now, in 1972, she did something else that is huge. She testified at the first national hearing about death with dignity, and it was conducted by the U.S. Senate Special Committees on Aging. And here's a quote from her, 1972. So listen to what she said. We live in a very particular death-denying society. We isolate both the dying and the old, and it serves a purpose. They are reminders of our own mortality. We can give families more help with home care and visiting nurses, giving the families and the patients the spiritual, emotional, and financial help in order to facilitate the final care at home. And this was in 1972. Keep this timeline in mind as we go forward. In 1974, the first American hospice was opened, and it was called Connecticut Hospice. 1974. 1974, the first hospice legislation was introduced to provide federal funds to support hospice programs, and it was not enacted. 74. So let's jump to 82. 1982. Congress included a provision to create a Medicare hospice benefit in the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1982 with a 1986 sunset provision, which means that it would expire automatically rather than renew. So 1986 came, it was due to expire, and they made it permanent. In 1991, hospice care was authorized in military hospitals and became part of the Veterans Benefits Package. So again, in the big scheme of healthcare, this wasn't that long ago that it just became a Medicare benefit in 1986, and it became a VA benefit in 1991. So let's look at some of the most recent statistics. And again, these came from the 2022 National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. And then there's going to be a resource sheet at the end where you can get all of this information. These numbers are staggering. This almost doubled in the last couple of years, that there's over 8,200 hospice agencies in the United States now. I want you to be thinking about why that is. Be thinking about why we're having more and more hospice agencies. Our baby boomers over the age of 65. The silver tsunami is here. Now, 2/3 of those hospice agencies are for profit, which means that 1/3 of them are not for profit. And last year in the United States, there were 1.72 million patients who were on hospice. These are some more numbers that have changed a lot about who receives hospice care, because we do tend to think that most hospice care is for the oldest of the old. And that's not the case. The majority, age 85 and older, but look at some of these other numbers. One of the numbers that jumped, age 65 and younger, 26.5%. I did a program last week on the frontotemporal dementias. And yes, that was with a plural, frontotemporal dementias. And we talked about that in the United States now, used to, the most common dementia for people under the age of 65 was Alzheimer's. And now, a person under the age of 65, the most common dementia is frontotemporal dementia. And it can be diagnosed as early as a person's 30s. Here's some other numbers that have changed, this is so good to see these numbers change. About 51% of Caucasians, about 36% African Americans, 33% Hispanic, 36% Asian Pacific Islander, and 33% Native American. Let's talk about the hospice philosophy as well. You're going to hear some terms like what we just talked about with Saunders and Kubler-Ross all the way back in the 1960s. This holistic approach. A holistic approach that encompasses physical, emotional, and spiritual concerns, not only for the patient, but for the family. That's one of the things that makes hospice so special. A holistic approach for the entire family. Now, care is individualized because it needs to meet that patient and the family's needs. And each patient and each family is going to be different. And it's going to meet that family and the patient where they are in their differences and lifestyles. Some more about hospice philosophy. And again, I can't say it enough because I think we need to hear it over and over. We know that rule of 7. We got to hear it at least 7 times for us to remember it. Hospice is going to focus on caring and not curing. They affirm life. They provide a lot of education so that the patients and the families understand what's happening and that they can provide the appropriate care as well. They're also going to help the patient and the family work through acceptance. Acceptance that this life leads to death. And acceptance that there is still time to grow, regardless of where we are in the journey. We're all somewhere in the journey. Hospice is going to emphasize comfort, And it is really going to work on the symptoms of the disease. They can't remove the cause of the symptoms. They can't remove the disease. We're past that by the time we come on hospice. But if we could treat the symptoms. And those of you who have ever loved somebody who was terminal, we understand that there's much more than physical pain. Psychosocial, spiritual. That is why hospice has a multidisciplinary staff. Some of the reasons why it may be time to choose hospice. And again, some of these are going to repeat because we're going to go through and we're going to do the 10 most common myths on hospice. We're also going to do the 10 most frequently asked questions. And so this one comes up again. Why do we choose hospice? The time that we choose hospice, look at this first bullet point. When medical treatments have been exhausted or the burden of treatment outweighs the benefits, it might be time to consider hospice. Let's think just a minute about what that's saying. And I'm going to share a story. My daughter had a very close friend whose mother had cancer. And she had fought the cancer and fought the cancer. And it kept coming back. And that mother was determined to be around until her child got out of high school. Even after she was told that she was terminal, she chose to keep doing the treatments to stay alive. But her quality of life was treatments and sleeping and treatments and sleeping. She wasn't awake, and when she was awake, she was in horrible, horrible pain. But she was alive. Once that last child graduated high school, got into college and kind of got established, and the mother saw, okay, they're going to be okay. She decided to stop treatments for the cancer because she wasn't curing anything. She was buying time, basically, is what she was doing with her treatments. So she switched over to hospice care and actually got better. She felt better. And they actually had some really good quality time for about the last 6 weeks of her life because she wasn't taking the treatments for cancer any longer. She had some really good quality time with her kids. She is a perfect example. The burden of treatment outweighs the benefits. The benefits of her treatments were that she was alive, but she had no quality of life. She came off, she went on hospice, and she had some pretty good quality of life for a short amount of time. But the end was good. She really wasn't very sick. Still had cancer, was still dying from cancer. That's what killed her. But it was her treatments that was really, really making her sick. Once a person goes on hospice, also, again, working with the families, using the chaplain and the social worker and the nurses and that team, patients and families can really start to feel like they gain a little bit of control. Pain and symptom management helps provide support to families. And it also helps families work through spiritual growth and personal growth because hospice empowers patients and empowers families to manage through the difficult times. Let's look at some guidelines. Hospice eligibility guidelines. Now, we know, and you've probably heard it say, that we can't check the barcode on the bottom of somebody's foot and see how long they're going to live. We don't know that. We are not God. We don't know. But healthcare professionals, especially those that have been doing it for a long time, we've got an idea And especially with dementia, which is what we specialize in, we have an idea when we think somebody's at the end stages of the disease and are continuing to progress. They may not be hitting that plateau. So when we think someone is 6 months or less, their prognosis is 6 months or less, if it stays on the projected course, that's eligibility. The patient chooses to forego life-prolonging aggressive treatments for a terminal illness. That's like the woman I was telling about. Or there are no treatments, like with dementia. We don't have any treatments. They've lost 10% of their body weight in the last 4 to 6 months. Because when most terminal illnesses will start to lose weight, and with dementia, we definitely start to lose weight. They're not metabolizing the food anymore. They're not eating as much anymore. They don't need the fuel. And I've said this many times, a person with dementia doesn't die because they stop eating. They stop eating because they're dying. The body knows. And finally, observable and documented deterioration in overall clinical condition in the last 4 to 6 months. And I added there, and a deterioration cognitively, in the case of dementia, in the last 4 to 6 months, observable and documented. Let's look at where hospice is provided. Most people who are on hospice are at home, just over half, 51.5%. And again, these are the newest numbers. About 51.5% of people are at home. Next is in a nursing facility or long-term care. So they may be at an assisted living, they may be in a nursing home, they may be a center like we are, a dementia care center. And so the nursing is provided there. Basically, what this is showing you, it's provided wherever the patient lives, whatever is their home. So when you hear me use the word home for the rest of this, it doesn't necessarily mean the house where they live. It's the home where they are now. Because look at some of these others. 12.8% are in a freestanding hospice facility. There's assisted living. That one's in blue. I'm sorry. The other one is long-term care. So the one in gray, 17.4, is a nursing facility, a long-term care. The one in blue is assisted living. But look at the 2%. These are people in a hospital. They may be in a homeless shelter. They may be in a correctional facility. They could be in jail. They could live underneath a bridge and still receive hospice services, because wherever that person calls home, they can receive hospice services. Need to make that real clear. It doesn't matter where they live. They can be anywhere and receive hospice services. Now, in a recent survey in the United States, people were asked where they would prefer to die. And 80% of people said they would prefer to die at home, the home where they live. Sometimes it just doesn't happen that way, because many times the person has been placed or they're not at home. So I want us to next look at the structure of hospice. Hospice is an interdisciplinary team. I've mentioned that a couple of times. And hospice meets and they develop something called a plan of care. Each plan of care depends on that individual's needs and the family's needs as well. That ID team meets and discusses the patient at least every 14 days. And they have to meet every 14 days, but some hospices may meet every 7 and go over every single one of their patients. Some may meet more often than that if they need to, and the family can actually ask for a meeting at any time, but at least every 14. And let's look at the members of the team. This team includes, first, a medical director. Now, this is a doctor. This is the doctor who certifies that the patient is eligible. They give direction and support. They write orders, and they visit the patients as needed. Then on the hospice team, there's going to be a director of patient care services. This is the person who manages the team. They supervise the patient care staff. Let me grab a drink. I can feel the tickle. They're going to make sure that that care is being delivered according to the plan of care. Sorry, excuse me. Then there's a nurse case manager. She supervises the LVNs and the CNAs, and she coordinates with the social worker. Then there are HHAs, or home health hospice aides. Many times these are CNAs, certified nursing assistants. They also may be trained caregivers, and they help with ADLs, activities of daily living. They can provide companionship. With some hospices, they provide light housekeeping and might even assist at mealtime. The majority of them do ADLs, activities of daily living. They do showers, they shave, they brush teeth, they help them get cleaned up for the day. And then there's social workers, and some hospices have counselors, licensed counselors on staff. For the most part, the social workers you're going to find are going to be LMSWs, licensed master social workers. There are some that are LBSWs, a bachelor's degree social worker. They provide emotional, mental support and counseling, financial evaluations. They assist to find resources. They organize transfers. They do admission to facilities. They do transportation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're the go-to person whenever you have a question. Many times they're even the liaison between the family and the hospice. There's also a spiritual care coordinator. They provide emotional and spiritual support as well. They do coordination with religious affiliations. They are typically non-denominational. They do prayer support. They can assist with planning the funeral. They can even do the funeral or the memorial service or the celebration of life. I've seen that done many times. There's a bereavement coordinator. This is the person who follows the family after the patient's death, and they provide support for up to 13 months after the death. And when you think about why is it 13 months? 13 months gets you through all of the first birthday, the first anniversary, the first Christmas, the first anniversary of the death, plus 1 month. They provide emotional support and dealing with grief. I don't know that I've ever heard of one that has told people if they needed to come back at 16 months or 18 months and they wanted to visit again or still be part of a group, that they've told them no. If they did, I'm sure they would refer them out to someone else. Then there's a team of therapists. And again, this is hospice by hospice. Not every single hospice has a music therapist, but many of them do. Or speech therapy, physical therapy, which in hospice, they typically might call this restorative therapy to try to maintain where that person is. They're not curing them. This therapy is not going to bring, it's not curative. It provides comfort. Occupational therapy and even massage therapy. And then there are also volunteers that work with hospice. That's how I got started in hospice many years ago. As I was teaching school, I became a hospice volunteer. And the volunteers provide non-patient care. They provide companionship. They can assist with administrative support and special projects. One of the things, probably the thing I was asked to do the most as a hospice volunteer, and again, being here in Fort Worth, the number one thing I was asked to do when I would go visit people who were on hospice was to read to them. And most of the time they wanted me to read the Bible. And I cannot tell you the hours that I have spent sitting up in the bed with people that were on hospice, reading them their Bible and talking about Bible verses with them. I was somebody who cared, but I did not have the emotional connection that the family had. So I was somebody coming in from the outside that would give the family a little bit of a break for a little while and was providing something that they needed. It's a great thing to do. Some of the things that hospice can help with. Number one, they are experts in symptom control and pain management. And then they provide the medication and the medical equipment that is needed for the diagnosis that they are on hospice for. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit. because the person may have some comorbidities, but of course, hospice is going to focus on the diagnosis that got them on hospice. They also assist with skin breakdown toward the end of life. We know that people, as we age, our skin starts to get thinner anyway, but as they start to have some skin breakdown, they will assist with that and some wound care. Nutritional counseling. This is where they will talk the family through and they will assist in as that person's diet changes. So they may talk about when we switch from regular foods to soft foods to pureed foods to thickened liquids, those type things. Help with ADLs, we've mentioned that, activities of daily living, shower, shave, grooming, that type thing. Another thing with the ADLs is a lot of times your hospice workers, the people who work for hospice, can teach the family members how to help transfer a loved one, especially if they're still at home. They may be able to bring in a physical therapist to show you how to properly move them from the chair to the bed, from the bed to the toilet, from the toilet to the wheelchair, whatever it may be, without hurting yourself. And you don't know if you don't ask. So it's one of those things to ask your social worker, ask your nurse. Social and family problems or stress management. That's why that social worker and that chaplain are there. They can sit and they can even do family mediations. The need for companionship. This is where the volunteers are used, and they also provide respite care. Respite care is there so the caregiver can get a break. And we're going to talk more about respite care and how much is given in just a few slides. Current and anticipated spiritual, emotional, and psychosocial needs. So whether the person has dementia or some other terminal illness, that family is going through ambiguous grief because they are loving and caring for somebody who is still very much alive, but they're also going through something called anticipatory grief, because once they go on hospice, we know that they likely have 6 months or less to live. And so, of course, we start down that road of anticipation. The hospice team, again, typically the social worker, can also help with advanced directives, a DNR, which is a do not resuscitate, and a power of attorney. More things that they help with. If the person is in the home, I've talked about them instructing families on how to provide care and also safety issues in the home. If they need a ramp put in to the front door, that social worker can assist in getting someone out to help with that, or getting you the resources. Community resources is the next one. Who could you contact to help get a ramp put in or bars put in the bathroom? They assist with quality of life. And again, this repeats with physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, music therapy, and massage therapy. Not all hospices offer all of those. They offer 24-hour professional support. You can get a hold of someone 24 hours a day. There's going to be someone on call. Short-term inpatient care for respite or symptom management. So, what the respite looks like. It usually can be up to 6 days and 5 nights. It usually is once every benefit period, which is about every 45 days. Now, the benefit period, the first benefit period is 90 days, and then we reassess. There's a second benefit period of 90 days, so we're up to 180 days. Reassess. And then it goes every 60 days. So it's 90, 90, 60, 60, 60, 60, 60. Now, there may come a time, and this happens, that sometimes a person might graduate off of hospice. Now, what in the world does that mean, to graduate off of hospice? And it's okay if they do. I'm going to use dementia as an example because that's what we do. We know with dementia, the person plateaus, they progress, they plateau, they progress. They may be at the end stage of dementia and they just seem to be on a steady decline. And so they go on hospice. And they may be on hospice, let's say they're on for 6 months or 8 months or 10 months. And every time it's time to reevaluate and re-up that benefit period, they're a little bit worse, or they've had a fall, or they've lost weight. And so they continue to requalify. But then comes the 60 days where they plateau and they graduate off of hospice. So they come off of hospice. As soon as there's a decline again, they can go right back on hospice. Families will get very confused about that. It really is not that big a deal. It happens all the time where somebody goes on hospice, they may plateau, they'll come off of hospice, they're going to eventually go back on. We're going to talk more about that, but just to kind of give you an idea what that means. They also will help with funeral planning and grief and bereavement counseling. And we start talking about funeral planning very early because we don't want to be in crisis and be trying to plan what funeral home should we call. Those are things that we need to be thinking of way ahead of time. Let's look at the levels of care with hospice. And there's 4 levels of care. The most common is what's called routine hospice home care. Now, keep in mind earlier I said this is wherever their home is. So this might be at their house. This might be in a nursing home. This might be in an assisted living. This might be in a memory care facility. This might be in a jail. This might be under the bridge. This might be wherever they live. But this is the most common level of care. And this is care in their home. Next, there's continuous home care. This is only used during a time of crisis. This is when care is provided between 8 to 24 hours to manage pain or other what at the time is an acute medical symptom. It's nursing care with the assistance of caregivers and aides. Now, make sure you understand this. Once a person goes on hospice, that does not mean that you have a sitter 24 hours a day. You do not. You don't have somebody in the home 24 hours a day. That's not what hospice is. What this is saying, the continuous home care, is if the person is in crisis, they can order someone for up to 24 hours a day until that crisis is over. There is inpatient respite care. We mentioned this earlier. It provides temporary relief for the patient's primary caregiver. However, it can also be used for symptom control. If somebody becomes so acute with their medical symptoms while they are at home, let's say their house home, they may go inpatient for a short period of time to get those symptoms under control. And again, we're going to talk more about symptom control. It can be provided in a hospital, in a hospice facility, at a long-term care facility. It's someplace that has 24-hour nursing. And then there's general inpatient care. This is what we were talking about, provided for pain control or other acute symptom management that cannot feasibly be provided in any other setting. This is only used when other methods are not working. And again, it can be provided at a hospital, hospice facility, long-term care facility, or 24-hour nursing. They're going to try to keep them at their home because part of going on hospice is that we don't want any more hospital stays. We don't want to be going back and forth to the hospital, especially with somebody with dementia. Going to the hospital is just devastating. It can even throw them further into a progression. So when we are finished with going to the hospital, we can talk about hospice. Now, we're going to talk about some exceptions also. But first, let's talk about who pays for hospice. It is a Medicare benefit. We saw that earlier. Medicaid also pays for hospice. Well, what if the person isn't 65? What if they're not on Medicare? Well, they may be on disability, or they may be on Medicaid, or they may have a private insurance that will pay for it. There's also self-pay. And I don't know of any of the hospices that don't offer reduced or free care or charity. That's just one of the things that they do. They will offer so many charity cases. But Medicare covers 100% of hospice services with no copay. It is a Medicare benefit. Now, I'm then always asked, so what is not covered? It does not cover for the nursing facility room and board. It's not covering that. It doesn't cover care unrelated to the diagnosis that they are terminal with. It does not cover care sought without consulting and approval from the hospice team. So we as the family can't decide, I'm going to take them over to such and such specialist and assume that the hospice is going to pay for that, because they don't. You have to consult with the hospice before you go do anything like that. They don't pay for non-formulary medications and supplies. In other words, the brand name medications. It's going to pay for generics. It does not cover curative or aggressive treatments, and it does not cover private sitters. So what are some reasons why people don't go on hospice? And these are the most common ones that I've heard. And this program started out as about a 30-minute program about 9 years ago, and it has grown to a 90-minute program over the years, and probably could be even longer than that. And I just keep adding to it. But here are the things that I've heard over and over and over again, that people fear that they're taking away hope whenever they start talking about hospice. That word failure comes up an awful lot. Death versus failure. I feel like I failed them because now we're going on hospice. I don't want to disappoint or let down my, and this is where education comes in, where we've got to talk through these misconceptions. The other thing is sometimes there's just a lack of consistency between the physicians, where one physician might bring it up, but another physician hasn't brought it up. And so the family's very confused. These are new statistics also. Now, this one I'm not so happy about, because the average length of stay across the board in the United States, the average length of stay on hospice was 18 days. That means the person got on hospice too late. They should have been on hospice earlier. And again, especially with the terminal illness, with something like a dementia, the earlier we can get on hospice and start taking advantage of this Medicare benefit, it is an added layer of hands, eyes, and ears. It's a whole nother team on top of the team that you've already got. But the average length of stay in the United States is 18 days. And you can see there 10% of people are only on hospice 1 to 2 days, which means that they went on hospice right at the end of their life. And then there's 10% that are on service for more than 88 days. I've had people be on service for 2, and I think the longest I've known personally has been 3 years, where they continued to qualify. They were a little bit worse at every time it was time to qualify. Or they went off and they came back on. On this particular chart, it gives you an idea. But again, across the board, the average is 18 days. Let's start into hospice myths. And again, this has been a collection of myths that I have gathered either from people or from programs that I've been in or webinars that I've been in. So let's start going through the hospice myths. If a patient lives longer than 6 months, he or she will automatically be discharged from hospice. And some of these you should already be able to answer just an hour into the program. We know that that is not true. That's false. Many people live longer than that first 6 months, and they will remain on hospice. Medicare regulations give unlimited 60-day recertification periods. That's why they may be on it for 2-3 years, as long as they recertify every time. Next myth, hospice is only for dying people. Hospice is for the entire family. Hospice focuses on the family. It focuses as much on that grieving family as they do on that dying patient. Next myth, if a physician orders hospice for a patient who lives longer than 6 months, that physician can be in trouble for fraud. Well, that would mean that the physician knows when a person's going to die. And of course, we do not know when a person is going to die. All the physician is stating is that they believe that they have a prognosis of 6 months or less. Myth: patients on hospice can no longer go see their doctor. They are continued to see their doctor, but what we are not doing is curative or aggressive treatments. But yes, you can still see your doctor. If patients go on hospice, they can no longer seek any treatments. All right, so let's look at what this says. Symptom management and pain control are the main goals of hospice treatment. There are many treatments that are for palliative care. The only treatments that aren't on hospice are curative treatments. So there's all kinds of treatments. So we use that word, and I've heard this said, you can't receive any type of treatment if you're on hospice. You can't receive any type of curative treatment if you're on hospice. You can receive treatments that are comfort measure treatments. Myth: hospice is only for people who can accept death. We stated this earlier when we were going through the very beginning of hospice. Hospice is for the living. Especially at the very beginning of a family coming on hospice, they haven't worked through and even been able to accept death yet. But that's what those hospice professionals are there for. And they meet you where you are. They let you work at your own pace. Hospice is for people who don't need a high level of medical care. Hospice is very serious medicine. This is a high level of medical care. They are experienced medical and nursing professionals, and they are the masters of symptom control. Hospices offer state-of-the-art palliative care. They use advanced technologies to prevent or alleviate distressing symptoms. So it is high-level medical care. Another myth, and we've mentioned this one a couple of times, hospice is when there's no hope. So I want you to hear it this way. When death is in sight, when someone is terminal, we've got two choices. We can yield to hopelessness, or we can live life as fully as possible to the very end. I want you to think back to that quote that we read at the very beginning about having life until the very end. The gift of hospice, it's its capacity to help families see how much can be shared at the end of life. And that's through personal and spiritual connection and sharing. I have seen some of the most beautiful connections made with family members after their loved one was on hospice. Hospice care is expensive. This is the last myth, and we've discussed this already because we have talked about how hospice is paid for. So it is a Medicare benefit for those that are on Medicare. It covers virtually all hospice expenses. There's very little out of pocket, if any. And even younger patients before the age of 65 may have private insurance that covers hospice, or they may be able to be one of the charity patients. So let's go over now into the most frequently asked questions. And probably the number one question is why I've got this one first is, what does hospice really do? And again, this point, an hour in, you can answer that. What does hospice really do? Holistic care, symptom management. There's number one. Emotional support, spiritual support, psychosocial intervention, addressing issues with the patient and the family, improving quality of life. The next most common question, and we've discussed this one, how do I know when it's time? How do I know when it's time for hospice? When they've been diagnosed with a prognosis of 6 months or less. Now, as a family member, you can ask for an evaluation. You can talk with your doctor and say, do you think it's appropriate to be evaluated for hospice at this time? What's the worst they're going to do? Say no? And even if they come out and they do an evaluation and they're not appropriate at this time, they'll tell you the things to be looking for when they've lost an additional however many pounds. If you have a fall, should there be a urinary tract infection? And they'll give you an idea of when they'd be closer to eligibility. Hospice is called at any time that the patient has been diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, because most hospice companies also have palliative care. And so maybe if they're not appropriate for hospice at this point, they may be appropriate for palliative care. And we're going to talk about the differences. We've already talked a little bit about it. Some more frequently asked questions. Where's the hospice care provided? We've answered that. It is wherever the patient lives. So if it is at their home, a nursing setting, an assisted living, wherever that may be. And then, are all hospices the same? And no, they are not. We saw earlier that 2/3 of all hospices in the United States are for-profit, and about 1/3 are not for-profit. They all have the general philosophy, whether they're for-profit or not for-profit, that general philosophy is the same. The holistic care, the psychosocial, the spiritual, the alleviation of pain from symptoms. So their services might differ. Some of the smaller hospices may not have all of those different therapies or have somebody on staff that can do those. She also mentioned, I've got to add this, if you noticed in the video, she mentioned pet therapy as well, because some of the hospices offer pet therapy, and a lot of times that's a volunteer. Let's look at the next one. Can my pain and symptoms be controlled at home? That is the goal. Wherever our home is that our pain and symptoms be controlled at home. Now, there's other symptoms other than pain whenever somebody is terminal. It might be nausea, it might be vomiting, it might be difficulty breathing. But that hospice nurse is available 24/7. Most symptoms can be controlled without the use of injections or an IV, because we're trying to get away from anything that causes pain. And we know that needles are not pleasant. Hospice has access to medications that are sublingual, go under the tongue. They're on patches. And it might even be something like a suppository, which isn't pleasant, but it's not a needle. Hospice medical directors are always available to adjust medications. Now, we said earlier that sometimes if it is so acute, if they are to the point that it just cannot be controlled at home, they may have to go inpatient for a short while. And maybe they do have to have IV medication for a short while to get it under control, but they can. That's an option they have. Okay, this question we've answered. Does hospice provide 24-hour in-home care? No, that is not what hospice is. It's intermittent nursing visits. It's the home health aide visits, social work visits, chaplain visits. But it is not 24-hour in-home care. That is not a private sitter coming in. The team members are available 24 hours a day. You can get somebody to answer questions anytime that you need support. The question also comes up when people are at home. They may say, can I live alone and still receive hospice services? And the answer is yes. Typically in the beginning, the answer is yes. But part of that admission packet is that there has to be a plan for the future. And typically, again, when somebody is terminal, there's going to come a time that there's going to need to be 24-hour care. So that hospice social worker, the nurse, the chaplain is going to talk the person through what's going to be that next step. Is there going to be placement? Is there going to be someone who can come in and help? Can a hospice patient choose to return to curative treatment? Of course they can. So I had mentioned earlier, I told the story of the woman who was on chemo and radiation. She was doing it to basically stay alive, and then she came off of it. If If she wanted to, she could stop hospice and go back to curative treatment if she wanted to. It's always a choice. And then they can come back to hospice if they want to. It's a choice. Can I go to the hospital and still receive hospice care? All right. So this was one of the ones that I'd said we'd get to. Let's say that a person is on hospice and they live here at our place. So we are a memory care center. And they are on hospice for the end stages of dementia, but they fall and they have such a gash on their head that we can't close it here. They need to go for stitches or for staples. Can they do that? Yes, they can. Some hospices, they have you come off of hospice while you're at the hospital, even if you're just there for a few hours. And then when you come back to where you live, you go back on. But many hospices now, if you're at the hospital for less than 48 hours and you're not receiving an aggressive treatment, they just leave you on hospice, like if you're there getting stitches, and then you come back so that you don't have to redo all the paperwork. Now, if you went into ICU or you started having aggressive treatments, that's different. Then you would come off of hospice. But if you go out to get stitches, and some hospices, even if you go to get an IV for a UTI, they'll leave you on service. Some take you off. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Is the decision for hospice care giving up hope or wanting to die? One moment, I'm going to get it.
Bless you.
Oh, I'm so sorry. And we've talked about this one. No, it is not giving up or wanting to die. It's about living. Hospice is about quality of life, bringing comfort to the patient and to the family, and helping them, here's the key, live fully until the end. And like the story that I shared with you, often the patients feel better because they have good pain management and they have good symptom management. It's about care and support. Ask this a lot. Does hospice do anything to bring death sooner? Because people will tell me, now my grandma or my mom was on hospice years ago, and they came in and they gave them some medicine and they died within 15 minutes. And so I have them tell me more. Well, they were in a whole lot of pain and they had their furrowed brow and they had fists and they were in so much pain. And they came in and they gave them some medicine and it's like they relaxed and they died. But medicine is not what killed them. They didn't die because they gave them the medicine. And I don't think any of us want to watch our loved ones die in pain. But if they gave them some medication that helped them relax and allowed their body to rest, and they were able to peacefully pass, I know that's what I would want. The goal is to alleviate suffering and manage symptoms. It doesn't do anything to speed it up or slow it down. The role of the hospice is to lend support. We've answered, do I have to be homebound to receive hospice services? Hospice meets you where you are. And then does hospice provide service to the families after the patient dies? Yes, for up to 13 months, you can take advantage of the bereavement services. Now, there are families who choose to tell the hospice, and especially if you were on service with them for 1 or 2 or 3 days, like we saw some people are, they may say, I don't need it or I don't want it. I sure encourage families to take advantage of having a grief counselor, somebody to walk you through grief. With dementia, we're going through grief the whole time. We're losing them a little bit at a time. And it is real grief, because grief is loss. So having a social worker, having a bereavement counselor to talk through, to do groups with, can be really helpful. Now, this entire slide talks about the difference in hospice and palliative care. And by this point in the program, you probably can answer this, but there are some specifics that I want to talk about. Hospice has benefit periods of every 6 months. It's 90 days, 90 days, 6 months, 6 months, 6 months. Palliative care doesn't have that. Palliative care they're not defined by a 6-month benefit. It is treatment that enhances comfort and improves the quality of life of an individual who's facing a serious illness, but they may not qualify for hospice, or they may just be continuing treatment, but they can do palliative care. Palliative care doesn't have to provide the same service as hospice. So you don't necessarily have the entire interdisciplinary team like you have with hospice. So you may not have access to spiritual services or social workers or all of the other therapists. That's with each individual palliative/hospice company. Those are questions that you want to ask. Now, this sentence is important, so I want you to hear it. If I can say it without coughing. All hospice is palliative, but not all palliative is hospice. That makes sense now? All hospice is palliative, so all hospice is comfort measures only, but all palliative isn't hospice, because you can still be receiving curative treatments. Let's look at some terminal illnesses, why people qualify for hospice. And these numbers changed drastically this past year. I have them typed in the order that they were last year, because cancer was number 1. And in 2022, dementia is number 1. Again, why is that? Silver tsunami. Our baby boomers over the age of 65. What's our greatest risk for dementia? Age. Now, when I say dementia, I'm talking about the umbrella term dementia. Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, early onset dementia. I'm talking all the dementias together, and I think that's why that number jumped through the roof, because cancer's always been number 1. Cancer's now behind heart disease. Heart disease is now number 2. Then cancer. Pulmonary and respiratory disease, stroke or coma, chronic kidney disease or renal failure. And then let me show you some of the other reasons that people do go on hospice. Multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy, a non-specific terminal illness, Parkinson's disease, ALS. Now, we used to use a term in healthcare called adult failure to thrive, but they don't use that term anymore. It's been changed. So adult failure to thrive, you can probably figure out what that means. It's now called protein calorie malnutrition, and it can be mild, moderate, or severe. And I found a statistic on it. 1.3% of the people who were on hospice last year were on for adult failure to thrive. We just don't use that term anymore. Huntington's, liver disease, advanced end stage, I'm not going to try to say that word, I'm going to mess it up, or debility. You know what that is? That's old age. That's just being life expectancy. And our newest one, COVID-19, and that is 0.9% was the statistic. There's our resources for this program. These are fantastic places to go to find information. There's where I got the facts and figures, the NHPCO facts and figures of 2022. John Hopkins has a fantastic site. I also use some from Vitas Hospice, the National Hospice Foundation. Excellent place to get information. The Hospice Federation of America, excellent place to get information. And then there's caringinfo.org. Excuse me. Here's my information, and I will have time for questions. I know we've got a lot in there. If there's ever anything that I can do for you, If you need to talk through something, if you need to brainstorm ideas, there's my email. I'm going to have Marty come back on while I grab a drink and talk about the CEUs, and then we're going to talk about 2 more programs.
Tag, I'm here. And just so you know, there's not a lot of questions. There's a few questions. They're really in Q&A are the questions. So and there's about 5 or 6 of them there. So as we said in the beginning when we got started, for those of you looking for certificate CEUs or certificates of attendance for today's webinar, James L. Westerners providing complimentary CEUs for licensed nurses, social workers, LPCs in the state of Texas. There also will provide a certificate of attendance if you'd like that. Please note that the people have gotten certificates from us before and used them for other licenses in Texas or licenses out of Texas. But just so you know, they're only set up for these licenses in Texas. So there's no guarantee, but you're more than welcome to go through the same process, get a certificate, and then submit it to them. Today's webinar is worth 1.5 hours of CEU credits. You must complete the SurveyMonkey evaluation in order to be eligible for one of the certificates. Please note that you'll get that survey evaluation link in a follow-up email that will go out after the webinar, usually possibly today, but it will go out by tomorrow, by the end of the day tomorrow for sure. The SurveyMonkey evaluation will be open through the 20th. Please note that once it closes on the 20th, we don't reopen them. It is just too labor intensive to deal with certificates one person at a time. And so we do them in batches all together by webinar. So please note, you really have to get it done by the deadline. The CEU certificate will be emailed to the email that you put in the SurveyMonkey when you answer those questions. So please make sure there's not a typo or something in that as you're doing that. Finally, there is a Google evaluation survey as well. That should pop up as you close out of Zoom today. If it doesn't, you'll also receive that link in the follow-up email. Please, we ask that you complete that as well. That helps us report back on those goals and objectives we set forth when we applied for the funding to put on these webinars. So that's, you can advance. Okay, so we've got 2 of them coming up. Next month, we're doing sexuality and dementia in English, but please know that they're doing virtual dementia in Spanish. If you could help us spread the word about that too, the link will be in there. We're having a hard time really getting out the word out to the Spanish-speaking community about these events we're doing in Spanish. So I'll have those links in the follow-up email as well.
Okay. And there are some questions. Let me stop sharing. Are these levels of care the same across the United States? What you'll find is it's going to be different with a different hospice, possibly. Now, I'm not sure what you mean by levels of care, though. The hospice philosophy itself should be the same. But as far as levels of care, I mean, those, like the statistics and everything that I use, those are across the United States, yes. Does long-term care insurance continue to pay if the patient's on hospice care? If they're placed, yes, they do still continue to pay. For the number of care, please explain why the numbers come to more than 100%. I asked that myself. This was the first time whenever I've added the numbers up, I went, this is over 100%. But that was, I took it straight from that website.
So I got it up too, and I didn't know. I went to the slide and tried to figure out the answer in case you weren't, didn't know what slide she was talking about. I couldn't figure out either, but we'll figure it out. I'll email you with something.
Yeah, I need to look at it. For 6 months, even though the team was moved on to another patient. The way that I understand that is that it's by the benefit period, that the payment is based off of the benefit period. And again, since that's not my end of it, is the money end of it. It is my understanding that they get paid off of the benefit period that they're in. I work in a dialysis setting. I have patients that receive dialysis and hospice. Most people do not know that this is approved by Medicare, that yeah, a person can continue to do that. Thank you for pointing that out. Is a stubborn UTI an indicator of end of life? It can be with somebody who has dementia, because I want you to think about, let's say that we initially, somebody has a UTI, they have dementia, we start them on an oral antibiotic. And eventually though, because think about what's telling that antibiotic to work. The brain's telling the antibiotic to work. Let's say then we try an antibiotic, an IV antibiotic, and it just won't clear up. And it may very well be the part of the body, the part of the brain that tells that antibiotic to work isn't there anymore. It has failed. And so that's one of the top 3 reasons that people with dementia do die, is they become septic. And many times it is from a urinary tract infection. So yes, that can be an indicator of end of life. Was this recorded? Yes, it was recorded. Is there an attendance sign in?
No.
I've heard a patient's feeding tube and it comes out after the patient goes into hospice. That is not replaced. Is this true? I've heard if the patient has a feeding tube. I don't know that I have had a patient with a feeding tube on hospice myself, because we don't do feeding tubes here. That is a good question. And that's from somebody anonymous. If you will email me, I will find that out for you. Should hospice notify the family to take weapons out of the house for a terminal cancer patient? I had a friend whose father committed suicide, but could have lived for another 6 months or more. I don't know that they are required to do that. I know personally, when I was going in people's homes, my very first question was, where's the gun, living in Fort Worth and being in the areas around Fort Worth. I know they're not required to ask it, but then I also know the suicide rate for people that are, especially if it was a man, yeah, it says a father, if it was a man who was over, and I'm not remembering the age right now, a certain age, that risk of suicides for somebody who's terminal is very, very high. But are they required to bring that up? I don't know that they are. I always brought it up just because part of it, I think, was experience, and because they could hurt the caregiver. That was another thing. I've had too many caregivers get hurt. Well, thank y'all very much.
Real quick, Natalie, I know you raised your hand. We're not calling on people just because we've got too many people online to be able to do that. But if you want to put something in the Q&A or something in the chat real quick, but we're getting ready to wrap it up. I lost my connection on my other computer somehow, so I was locked up. So I think we got to everything.
Okay, thank you, GJ, for clarifying that. He said they are a reflection of percentages of the population, not the total population. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Is a completed out-of-hospital DNR required for hospice? It doesn't have to be. No, there's people that are on hospice that don't have it. They will talk to you about it. It's highly recommended once somebody is on hospice that we're not going to go in and do heroic measures, that we're going to allow them to have that natural death and not do chest compressions or attempt to do CPR.
Holly's information will be in the follow-up email as well. The contact, if you have any questions for her, or you can send me the question, I'll forward it on to her, whatever works for you. And Holly, once again, as you saw with the comments, incredible job.
Thank you. Thank you. I encourage everybody to be on our next hard topic to talk about. Sexuality and dementia is our next one. So yes. That's always another one with a big turnout. And I do apologize. I was coughing so much. I will be all better.
You know what? I appreciate you being here. I mean, you came up and stuck it out and got it done. And seriously, thank you very much. And you guys, we'll get the webinar up to the YouTube channel and get you the links here in a week or two as soon as I can. But look forward to the follow-up email this afternoon or tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, you all, and have a great day.